questions that I wrote for everyone. Naughty boy.
And where are those located?
I mean, you reviewed the PR, dude. It's in community repo.
I can't remember.
But yeah, like the only problem is that we probably live stream now with Thinking Out Loud label.
Perfect.
Let's
I
double
should be
check.
able to. I should be able to change that, right?
Only in YouTube.
Huh.
On Twitter and LinkedIn, no. But yeah, it's not a big deal. Yeah, Thinking Out Loud again.
Are we live now?
Yes, because you clicked on live. That's how it works. You click and it works. You see?
Easy.
Easy peasy.
Okay, so I can't change anything, right?
No, it's like you can run the meeting and I will just change it at least in YouTube and later don't forget to ask Fran to get access to Restream so you can go to Restream and modify it always before the meeting.
Will do.
Yeah, and you see.
And then I'll read your installation thingy.
Yeah, I mean that's what people write docs for, so somebody reads them.
Yeah, until you forget that they're there. That's yeah.
There must be a better way to do this, right? Or maybe not yet, but there should be a better way to do this, like to have like a different project inside Restream, right? With channels where you want to publish, and so I can customize it myself without altering other projects. They have something like projects, but they don't respect the destinations, I think. I don't know. I wonder if it's a bug on their end.
No, I don't think it's just yet supported. And then you need to wait for Zoom to enable you to configure it as well.
Oh yeah, but that's another thing. Yeah.
So maybe in 6 months.
Or in 6 years. Yeah.
Thanks, Jonas.
You're welcome. Well, I guess we can get started. It's like, yeah, it's 7 past. So welcome everyone. Before we get into it, does anyone want to introduce themselves, or do you have anything you want to add before we get into the agenda? No? Okay. Wait, I did something. There. All right, so actually these two agenda items is more or less in the same scope. And these questions kind of came from friends thinking out loud with Laurent. I'm probably butchering that name, but sorry. One of the things they discussed was it's quite unclear what exactly the scope of Async API is, in the sense that now we have a suggestion about changing the meanings of how you define an API. That instead of having this kind of client-server perspective, like opposite perspectives, we now define it, or the suggestion is to define it purely from the application side of things. So instead of defining what you as an external force to the application can do, it's what the application does. Because before it was, if you defined an operation such as subscribe, it means that you externally can subscribe to this event, but the application itself is publishing to it. This is kind of changing, or there's a suggestion about changing this in 3.0, which is instead of you defining it from the client's perspective, or whatever we can, like the verb for it, but it's instead defined as what the application does, and from the API perspective from there.
Yeah, so it's changing from let's say pure API concept to behavior, like what it's doing, what is the application doing? So yeah, it's still an API. You define an API because you have to define the interface where you're publishing or where you're subscribing and so on. But yeah, it's not the typical API point of view, which is from the consumer or from the external, as you said, right? I think external defines it quite well. External to the application. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's something that's working really well in OpenAPI with HTTP because you have a client and a server.
Yeah.
It makes sense in that perspective, and it's where it's coming from, right?
There are many assumptions there that make sense. Like, well, first of all, it's always HTTP. Secondarily, it's always request response. And it's always the same topology, client and server. So it's always the same constraints, always the same assumptions. So this is clear. There's no room for interpretation, like in the case of Async API. So yeah, what we have right now is inherited from OpenAPI. We knew it when I launched version 2. We knew it. We were about to change it, but we didn't in the end because there wasn't any agreement on what to do. And if I left, I was like, if I changed it, there was some people complaining that I changed it, and if I don't change it, there were some other people complaining. So I decided to leave it as it was in version 1. Like, don't touch it in version 2 because it's not clear yet. But I released version 2. And now I think we're more clear what we want to do because we reorganized the whole spec to accommodate to new meanings, let's say, to new semantics. And I think now it makes sense to define behavior especially because we also defined somewhere, I can't remember where, but we have to probably make it more prominent that so from these, in case you're doing, I don't know, like server and client with Async API, HTTP or WebSocket or something like that, from the server definition, there's no guarantees that you will be able to infer the client, right? What the client can do. So there are no guarantees of this. And actually, there are no guarantees in OpenAPI as well. but yeah, in OpenAPI, it's a little bit less problematic. So people don't really complain a lot about it. But yeah, so what we're suggesting in version 3 is that we create one definition for server and one definition for the client. In this case, is in the case of client server. In the case of brokers, so then you define one Async API file per application, which is per client, per broker client. So yeah, so that's that eliminates the problem altogether. Because the problem was always like, yeah, but from one point of view you have this, and then from the other point of view you have that. Okay, so there's only one point of view now. You cannot infer the client behavior from an Async API file, the external behavior from an Async API file. If you do it, cool, but know that what you're doing is not 100% correct or supported, so it may not fit well. Instead, what you should do is define an Async API file for your client, not for your server. So that eliminates the need of, that removes the whole problem about the perspective. So yeah. But it moves the problem to the user a little bit, which is like you have to create two Async API files, one for the server and one for the client. And that is not a problem, but it's always cool to have just one Open API file, right? And you generate the server and the client. And so it was cool to have one Async API file and generate the server and the client as well. But yeah, it is what it is. We're not Open API. We're not doing REST APIs.
I have a question about that.
Yes.
So we will describe the client by the publish and subscribe
Send and
names.
receive.
Yeah, but you know that from the server perspective, so then the send and receive will change, yes, the meaning of the inside the operation.
Yes.
I mean,
basically.
if we were to keep the same names, publish and subscribe, then it changes.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
the reverse,
yeah,
right?
reverse.
In most of the cases, not all of them, right?
But maybe we should still have the publish and subscribe, but only when you describe the client, you know. So then you exactly.
It's always a client. I mean, it's always, yeah, that's what we're trying to avoid, not having clients or servers or anything. So we eliminate the problem of the perspective. It's just an application. We don't care what the application is doing, if it's a client, if it's a server. It can be a mix, if you think about it. An application can be a REST API server and receiving a request and then publishing a message to a broker. So it's a server and a client at the same time. It's a server, it's a REST server or HTTP server. And let's say you don't publish to a broker, but you call another HTTP API somewhere. When you receive a request, you're a client and a server at the same time. You're a server accepting requests, but you're a client making requests to other servers. So that's why I think we should get rid of this. This is a server, this is a client, no, it's an application. It can be doing multiple things. We don't know.
Okay.
Anything else is just us trying to wrap our heads around it and calling it client or server or provider or consumer or whatever, but yeah, not really. It doesn't really match the reality, right? That's the thing. For simple use cases like creating just a REST API or just a broker client or something like that, that works. But the moment you have something that is not simple, but it's pretty common, that you receive a request and then publish a message to a broker, something like that, then it doesn't work anymore. Then what are you? Are you a server? Are you a client? You're both. Right. And on top of that, to remove confusion with publish and subscribe, we rename it to send and receive because it's an action. Well, it's an action that you're doing. You're sending or you're receiving something. And also to remove confusions, because some people, when they see publish and subscribe, they think that Async API is only for pops up, for the pops up pattern, right? And that's not true. So actually our publish has the meaning of sending and subscribe has the meaning of receiving. And then we reverse it. But what I mean is that from our perspective, the way we're interpreting the spec is that publish can be any kind of sending messages, right? So not necessarily pops up pattern. So that's why I propose that we get rid of this as well. And we make it something really neutral, like sending and receiving, and that's it. Shouldn't be confusing anymore, I hope.
Does anyone have any questions regarding this perspective or change of perspective? Something they want clarified or something that doesn't make sense to them? By the way, I can't see chat in LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. I don't know if you can look at.
You can see what?
I cannot see the chat in Restream.
In Restream, okay.
In Restream? Why would you see a chat in Restream?
Because I can't see the chat in YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter. don't know if you can.
But in Restream, you won't see chat because Restream is now used as a platform to stream to other platforms from Zoom.
Right.
But you should see a live chat in YouTube.
Sorry.
Let me check if I can see it.
I don't think I can see it now.
Yeah, it's there, just nobody writes.
Okay, perfect.
But I wrote hello. And following your question, no questions from my side because I didn't watch Thinking Out Loud with Laurent. So I have to catch up.
You have a good excuse.
Was it when I had holidays?
I think so. Yeah.
I hope so.
I hope so.
Yeah, it's. I guess we can bring off on the new topic, which is like, how can we define a reasonable scope for Async API in terms of what is expected from the spec? Because this is something I've been wondering in terms of, for example, the many meanings of Async API. Like, if we wanted to define that, you can like define something like a system of multiple applications. It goes, I won't say against the specification, but it kind of does, because you no longer define what an application does in the API sense, but you start to define a larger scope and a larger system, which is like, if you have a platform where you want to integrate Async API, like the specification for it and support it, like we are forcing a lot on those consumers of the specification, but nowhere is that scope defined. So in theory, we could do it, if that makes sense, and suggest to have such a keyword. So my question is more or less like, what should we do to not limit ourselves too much in terms of what we are able to solve, and in terms of what's reasonable for everyone to expect? And it's a large question, so feel free to break it down into smaller sections.
I don't know. I think there are many how's it called, like ways to look at it, right? So when you scope something, you can scope it in different in different dimensions. That's what I was trying to find. So what you can do, for instance, what you mentioned, like I think the scope for Async API right now is pretty clear. It's the application, right? This is for a single application. At least I think it's defined in the spec, but if not, we should. But that's only for the application. And that's why you have the ID field on the root, because it's the application ID and so on, right? Because you're defining an application. But yeah, at the same time, is an application mixed with some API, with some API in the sense of interface, right? So even I remember a guy from ING Bank, can't remember now. Yeah, so he was mentioning that he wanted to create an API definition with Async API, not the application. So he wasn't defining the application, he was defining an API. And then his application will implement this API, this interface. So pretty much the concept of interfaces in programming languages, like in Java interfaces, for instance, where you can have an interface and then you have a class implementing an interface. So the same thing. So the class will be his application, and the Async API file will be the definition, the interface definition. And he might not even just have one application implementing this interface, but multiple applications, different applications of different origins and sources to implement this API, this interface, or even more, implementing multiple interfaces, right? Multiple Async API files. So that is an interesting concept. But the reality is that I will say it's too granular, right? It's too much. And people are, I will say, like, people are always expecting the simplest solution, right? So I want to create my API, like with OpenAPI, or with the GraphQL. I want to create my API, and that's it. Tell me how I do it, right? How do I define it, and how do I generate code or docs or whatever? And then, yeah, you can get as complex as you want, and think that these are APIs or interfaces. Let's not call it APIs to differentiate them. So it's just the interface definition. And yeah, you can compose your application of multiple interface definitions. But yeah, I'm not saying that we cannot do it, but like assuming that an Async API file or an OpenAPI file is not an application, it's just only the interface definition, it can be tricky for some people, because some people are not so well versed in APIs and they only just fucking want to generate documentation or code or whatever. And you just being a smart ass there with them, telling I know much more than you, I know how to do interfaces and all this stuff, and how to split all this in different concepts, and in the meantime the developer is just like, fuck off, like just let me generate the docs or the code. Don't bother me with this. I have an application and I want to define it. So yeah, or I have a whole system, or I have a broker with a lot of topics and I want to define them. So don't bother me about this. We can, of course, provide mechanisms for people who want to do this, but I don't think it should be the default, to be honest. So anyway, what I was saying is that there are many ways to define the scope. So we can define the scope like it's for an application, it's for a system of application, it's for a menu of channels. Is it to define the broker, or what? Or is it to define just the interfaces? Yeah, we have to define it, what it is about. I would say it's for an application. That's what it is. You might like it or not, but that's what it is, or that's what has been so far. With version 3, I introduced a new thing, which is like, if you don't provide operations, then it's not an application. It's a list of channels. I can accept this is arguable. Maybe it's not a good thing, because then the whole document mutates the meaning just because it has or doesn't have a key. I'm not happy with this solution as well. but yeah, I think it's easy, like to just don't define operations, and then it's not an application, and then it's something else. Another way of doing it is that we go the RAML way, and we have another field on the root saying which kind of document this is. So by default it's an application, but you can have something like kind, I don't know, kind menu, menu of channels. And if it's menu of channels, then operations field is not allowed. Then you have like different specs, right? You can separate them in different specs and evolve them separately. because you have like different kind of documents, not just one async. You don't have an async API document. You have different types of documents. That it's could be an option, but then it complicates things a little bit, because then on tooling you will have to be clear that it's not this tool doesn't support supports async API. It's not clear enough. Supports async API what? The applications, the menu of channels, which kind of documents it support? All of them, some of them, you know what I mean? So so yeah, it has trade-offs as well. So maybe a way to do it is that we keep async API as what it is, as an application definition, and then we can create another spec, simpler spec, which is just for a menu of channels, and then we call it something else, like not async API at all. So async API is not even in the name, just to avoid confusions. And then it's like, I don't know, we have the Async API spec, we have the, I don't know, channel definition spec, something like that, whatever. And then a tool can just support channel definition spec. That will be completely fine. Or just Async API, but it doesn't support the channel definition spec, or they can support both. That also eliminates a lot of pressure from tooling vendors, because they don't have to support everything. But I'm not so concerned about tooling vendors here. I'm more concerned about the user. And for the user, it can be a little bit more chaotic, that there are different kinds of documents. And especially unless you make it explicit, it can be tricky to differentiate them at a first glance, if you're not experienced in Async API, because they look the same. So
yeah, I guess like bottom line is there's many ways that we can like end up like where we end up. My main concern is, how do we get to that step where it's well defined? Because if Laurent is saying, if we take that question of like questioning what exactly Async API is, because I think we heard this a few times before as well, that either the scope is not well defined or well written down in a way that's what can you say, like that everyone can understand and what to expect from the specification. Because yeah, as I said earlier, it's more about those that are starting to leverage Async API, that if it's not well defined and they suddenly get something that's not expected, where they expect something different. And I guess I can even give an example. For example, and it's not to say anything bad, but for example, Json Schema is being used for code generation.
Yeah.
Json Schema is not for code generation at all. You shouldn't even be doing it. But the problem is you can do it in a shitty way, but you can do it. So it's kind of like everybody tries to force the use cases down on that specific specification when it's not supposed to support that specific use case.
Yes.
And that creates confusion, a lot of it actually. So I just wanted to see if like, how can we be more structured in that way, or give something that's expected, like what you can expect.
So actually, one of the use cases that I see a lot is that people are putting the verbs there, but they're not using them. So for instance, so people who want to create a list of channels that they have available for them on a broker, and they put there like publish or subscribe because they have to validate, to make the document validate, but they're not giving any meaning to it. They just want it to appear in a documentation, in an HTML documentation or something, right? Because they just want to see the documentation there. And the application is called the broker, right? So it's not an application, it's a broker. So they're hacking Async API to make it work with their own purpose. But then when they have to generate code, it suddenly makes no sense. Because well, first of all, it doesn't make sense to generate code for a list of channels on a broker. Maybe the only thing that can make sense there is use something like Modelina to generate classes or types for specific messages, and that's it. But you don't have an application sending or receiving messages because it doesn't make sense, right, on a broker level. But if they try to generate code from this document, they will get an application that is publishing or subscribing to something, and is like, what the fuck? This is not what I expected, right? So that's why we're providing this other alternative, that you are able to define a list of messages without any operations, right? We still have to figure out if the best way to do it is on the, like mutating the meaning of the document just because you have operations or you don't have operations, or like I said, creating a separate spec with another name that is just for that specific use case. And and then you don't use Async API, you're using yada, yada, yada.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So an Async API is just for the application, which still makes sense to keep it for this because it has API in the name. Right?
Yeah.
It will still be a specification under Async API organization and so on. But yeah, or the other alternative is that we call the existing so the specification that is to define an application, we call it the Async API application spec, and the other one is the Async API broker spec or something like that. Whatever. And then we can clearly say, like, we support a application. This tool supports application spec, or this tool supports only the broker spec, or both, or whatever. Right. So yeah.
How can we get to that point where we can say that we have it well defined what Async API is for? Like what kind of steps can we take now that makes sense? Like how do we move it forward? Will it happen naturally?
No, it's not going to happen naturally. So my advice is that any of you, it can be myself as well, take a decision and write it down. Like this is my PR. Here it is. I took the decision to make it like this. And this is when you scare people, and then people start complaining, and then you gather the responses and the ideas and so on, right? And because if you're trying to just create an issue and wait for people to give you feedback, people will not give you feedback most of the time, because nothing urgent. But if there is fear that something is going to break their use case, and it's almost there, almost is about to get merged, you're going to get a comment in your pull request instantly, right? So yeah, so that's one way I suggest. Just go with something and then and expect, and you leave it there for a while to receive as much feedback as possible, and that's it. And
I also think it would be a good idea to include what it's not. Actually, at the same time of saying what it is, it's maybe also a good idea to take some of those use cases that we heard and say, this is not for it.
Maybe not in the spec, or maybe in the docs, something like that. Exactly. You can clearly explain this, or a non-normative, I think it's the name, non-normative section of the spec, which is like documentation inside the spec that is not normative. So it doesn't define any rules.
Yeah.
But it's just for you to get informed about something. So that will be probably a good use case on how not to use a spec. And but yeah, I think that's the role of documentation, right?
Yep.
That's what documentation.
Verify things.
Yeah, but I agree that some people might skip going to documentation when they're reading the spec, which I honestly don't think so. But if they're reading the spec, they will. It will be cool if they find some references like how not to use it, and then just a link to the documentation, right?
Yep.
Or maybe in the README or something like that.
I think it makes sense if I create an issue for this specific thing and then highlight what we already know and what we don't, and then take it from there.
Yeah, create the issue. Like, let's follow the usual process. Create the issue, leave it there for a while to see if we get feedback. Then create the pull request, leave it for a while to get feedback, and so on. And that's it. If nobody complains, then it's either they don't give a fuck, or they like it. So in any case, you should continue.
That's
move on. So yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Or they're not even they don't even know that it exists. So
they don't. That's
So-
also a problem.
but yeah, that's why we're leaving it there for a while, and we will put it on Twitter, and I can talk about it on Thinking Out Loud. And so we give it visibility. I mean, I think we're doing a lot of effort to for people to understand that we're doing things, and we cannot do more, I think.
As much as we can, at least.
Exactly. We're doing talks as well in conferences. So I mean, blog posts. What else?
Anything we can.
Yeah. If then after some time people don't even realize it exists, then it's probably because they're not paying attention, or because like life, they're doing something else. So yeah.
Anyone else have any comments to that item?
So basically, like for 40 minutes, you were talking about all the topics that we always discuss, like the perspective of the Async API file, and again, if it should describe the application or a broker, just to clarify.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
This is how
we're moving forward.
Like in Scrum.
This is how important it is. Yeah. No, but I love it that it's getting clearer now. Like, I think it's getting clearer. So yeah.
It's another opportunity for people to start asking questions, right?
Yes.
And raising awareness for it. Especially since it's such a radical change in a sense that, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, next up, a simple little one. Should we move the JSON schema files for bindings to the JSON schema repository? I made a suggestion that, or let me clarify, in the bindings repository, we currently have all the protocols, all the bindings there, but we also have, for example, no, maybe take one that has Kafka.
That's something. Yeah, JSON.
Something that has JSON schema validation rules for those specific bindings. Currently, these are not exposed in any way other than here on GitHub. And as far as I know, no validation tools currently use them to validate bindings. So bindings it's basically an extension that can be anything you want. It doesn't validate that you define it exactly as the bindings specify. Now, the proposal is that we move those JSON schema files to the I can't remember the name, Spec JSON schema, to the main JSON schema repository where we have the files for the specification itself, where you actually can validate the Async API documents with. That is basically the suggestion. Magic, do you want to say a few negatives about moving?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have any negative about that idea, but I had a problem how we want to make the validation process. This is only my excuse, because as I understand, you want to merge the JSON schema of the binding inside the main JSON schema, yeah, of the specification.
Yes.
Yeah. And I suggested the another way to treat something like the binding, treat the binding as the extension, to add the definition of the binding to the extension definition, yeah, as we have in the extension catalog. We have some example of that. Yes, how do you how you can create the extension, how you tell where you want to have that extension, and that's it, as I remember. Yeah, so it's only the problem. So yeah, I mean, I don't have the problem to move that, but yeah, we should discuss how we want to make the validation. Yes.
Yeah, so what you're basically, as I understand, proposing is that whenever you validate an async API file, automatically the binding should not be validated without you doing something actively in the implementation for it.
Yeah, exactly, in the tooling. Yeah, because by this you only add one time the definition of extension, of the binding, and then you exactly can validate by the old spec version. Yeah, because this is the problem. Then we exactly have to the update the old version when we create the another binding. Yeah. Or even, I don't know, maybe we should something like that. Someone create the for version of the given binding, yeah, for the given Async API version, but then we tell, okay, but we have the new Async API version, so if you want to use the new version of the binding, you should use the new version of Async API. Yeah, so so it's also the problem for me. How to handle that? Yes, because I don't think so that the people should update the main JSON schema, but it should we should have something like the workflow, yes, that we update automatically. So,
yeah, bindings are like links, like links to another spec, to another another thing, to separate spec with a different workflow lifecycle. So putting them together into a single place will make them be bound to each other.
And very complex. It's also the problem. Yeah.
So yeah, and what Maciek said, like then if you want to use a previous version of the main schema, but you want to use a new version of one of the bindings, you can't, because unless you maintain files for all the versions of which,
And then we cannot make something like the champions for the given binding, yes, because all the time everyone will update the main JSON schema, and at the moment you cannot say that, okay, from this from this line to this line, then we have the another code owner. Yeah.
But we have these files; they're gonna be split. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's gonna be split.
So that's not a problem.
Yeah.
And the problem is that we, like, the bindings are there for some time already, and we're talking about this perfect world of having it separate, separate life timeline of development, etc. But like, if we don't just move them in and integrate with references and bundle together, like in the end, JSON schema, it's not a spec, right? We always said that JSON schema, it's just a tool. So even though the markdown is still worked on separately, so I don't, for example, like my input in this discussion is that, like, I for example don't see a problem that we bundle it together. And the advantage of actually start doing it, try to bundle it together, this will trigger us actually do something with this topic. And in action of doing it, we'll really have to start figuring out this versioning, how that should work, what problems we have, like really identify technical problems, and not like it might be wrong, it might be bad, etc., etc.
So what about if I want to use, let's say, version 2.0 to 2.0 of the spec with latest binding that was developed, released yesterday? If it's bundled together, your JSON schema will be the one that is mapped to 2.4, not 2.0, unless we update all the JSON schemas to point to the new one.
That's true.
So you have
should
to
have the logic to,
you have to maintain
to
also
recognize.
the past versions. You know what I mean?
No.
You don't really have to do that, bro.
Unless we use the $ref or something like that, and then you bundle the yeah. In this case, yes.
Yeah, it's
Sorry.
it's all like, again, like so for example, if you're gonna ask me some, like if you're gonna challenge me with some questions like what if version this and version there and like what scenario will look like, I don't know. But what I know is that I think all these issues, like, again, it's just my imagination, but I think that all these issues like versioning, etc., it all can be solved with references, proper bundling, script, and proper release process. And that's,
yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, no, I didn't think about it, but it's true. Like it can still be separated, not like hard coded inside the document, just in another file, and then each version, each JSON schema file for each version just has to reference those files and then just bundling process, and that's it.
Yeah. We can accept that solution, yeah, but we have to know that the people want to create the private bindings only in the given company, yeah. So by this we need
that's extensions, right?
That's extension.
Yeah, it's extension, yeah. Exactly.
Actually, I don't think it's allowed by the spec. Let me check, but the spec should not allow custom bindings, if I'm not mistaken.
By the extension definition, you have to kind of,
but that's
exactly.
That's an experiment. That is not. There's nothing defined yet. That was just an experiment. So that is not. So, for instance, you cannot put your magic binding, right? That's, you can use x-magic, but not magic inside bindings. You cannot use custom words there, and that was done on purpose, just so people don't start creating their own bindings that we will release in the future, and then they don't match, and then it's a mess. So yeah, it's like a reserved space for us to keep evolving over time, and otherwise you should use extensions. And extension catalog and the definition system that is on the extension catalog was just an experiment. There's nothing decided yet there. So
but you can use the extension inside the binding, as I remember.
Yes,
I think you can use extensions inside the bindings, but it's just an extension. So it doesn't have the meaning of a binding, so it doesn't mean it's a binding.
But it can be, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can put a binding on the root of the document if you want, but it's an extension, so it can be whatever you want.
I think I'm gonna bring this up next time as well, and then we can jump to metrics.
Like in the Scrum, yes. So we have the meeting. We discuss about that we should create another meeting to discuss.
Yeah, because then you can think. Then you can think about it for a second. Like, go to sleep, wake up, write some notes. Go to sleep, write some notes, and then we come back and meet. All right.
Okay. Jonas just wants to make sure that people will come again to the meeting because we still want to discuss the topic.
Exactly. But it's
like so this the topic will jump, pop up, jump in, jump out, pop out. Pop up, I think is the proper word. Will pop up again in a few weeks, because if one of the ideas that I've submitted for Async Api mentorship is actually do the same MVP approach with extensions. Like, again, don't think only about this like long-term perfect plan. We have some plugins, whatever. No, just take those extensions, take them into JSON schema repo, and let's enable people to finally do it, and then we can of course improve with next versions. But if we don't do MVP, then like it will stay there forever.
Yeah, since it's not a spec, it's just a tool, then in the future we can release another version where we split it out, and that's it. We take it out of the JSON schema file. Yeah, I think it's a good approach.
Yeah,
it's a good iterative approach. So yeah.
But I still need to convince TSC members to vote for this topic to be selected for mentorship. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 TSC members on the call. So you guys know what to vote for. Thank you. Next topic.
Let's forget about all the other topics that you can vote for. Just vote for that one.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, like the Glee one, for instance.
Yeah. Magic.
Oh, my item.
Take it away. Yes,
Yeah, it's my last item. When I worked with Sergio on the next parser.js version, I see that we probably have some problem with defining the metadata for the main section inside the Async API specification. Yes, I mean the servers, channels, operation, and the messages, and all of them has the different metadata. And I mean by metadata, I mean something like the descriptions, summary, title, name, also the tags and external documentation, and also the ID, like the operation ID or message ID. Yeah? That from the perspective of application, it's not needed, but maybe it's needed when you read the documentation by the HTML template or Markdown template, or you want to generate something. Yes. So yeah, and by this, when I create a lot of methods, I see why on channel I can only define the descriptions. In servers also descriptions, but the message I have the summary, but it can be the description also. Yeah. The name is exactly for the code generation. Yes, that you can generate the class name, for example, and for example the tags to categorize some elements, some messages and operations. But you cannot, for example, attach the tags to the channels and servers at the moment. Maybe by this we can we can support something like a grouping of servers. Yes, that one time Sergio create the issue for that. So by this, I propose to the next version of Async API to have something like the info item object, like we have in the Async API in the root, but only in the element. And as you can see, when you Jonas up Google, and it's exactly the shape of the given object. Yes, it will be the same for the server, for the channel, operation, and message. Of course, by ID, it's exactly something like the ID of message is message ID. Yeah, so it's old message ID. The info ID in operation is exactly the operation ID, etc., etc. Yeah. So yeah. So what do you think about that? I mean, it probably will be the benefits of that. It's easier handling in the tooling, like the parser.js to create the models, and exactly the people know that okay, I have the channel, servers, messages, operations, so I know the shape of metadata. At the moment, I always have looked to the specification. Okay, in the message, I can define the summary, yes, or the name, but in the channel servers, I cannot. So
I correctly understood that this new object is not for the root.
Nope, it's only for the element. Yeah, it's only for the this for elements: server, channel, operation, and message. And maybe also in the schema, but it's I don't want to discuss at the moment about that. But yeah,
that's going to be complex.
Yeah.
I have two concerns with this. So one is for tooling, it will be cool because that is it's clear. But for the user, look at the examples. It's one more level of indentation, so it's not really friendly. I would say, especially in a already indented, because the document is already. You probably adding this information in a already indented place, so it gets out of fucking hands. But so my question here will be, does it really need to be inside an info object? Like can it, for instance, can't we just unify all of this? Like server will have ID, title, summary, description, tags, and external docs, and that will be the same for all the objects.
I mean, we can, but yeah, I'm in the group of people that want to, to have something like the nested schemas for one type, not something like everything, but yeah.
I know,
we can do that. We can do that, but yeah, I put the info because I like that style.
The thing is that when you put the info there, then you could, to me, it causes confusion. And actually, Jonas asked about it, and does it have something to do with the root info object? And you said no, it's different. So one more source of confusion.
Yeah, it's different because maybe it will be, but in the root you have the version, yes. But
yeah, the thing is, so I think what you're trying to achieve here is for the benefit of the tooling, implementation, not for the benefit of the user. And my suggestion is that you don't create an object, but you create an interface. So your objects will implement this interface, and you can still extract it as a separate interface definition, right? So server, channel, message, and whatever is going to be included, you can just say in the code implements info item whatever.
Yeah, like the specification, yes, that the given object can implement the extension. Yeah.
This way, it can still remain on the same level as the other thing. So you don't. You don't force people to have one more object, because it's in YAML. That's a problem, because it gets crazy. It gets crazy how much you have to indent sometimes.
Yeah, but probably in the tooling it will be called by the info. Yeah, to
in the tooling can be whatever. Yeah, but but the thing is that from the user point of view, I think this is confusing with the info object on top, and also it's not in my experience or in my opinion, it's not user friendly to have one more level to nest stuff inside. But that's just an opinion, not nothing. It's nothing. It's not a fact, right?
Yeah, sure.
So,
but is it really this indent? Is it really a problem? Because in the end, the objects would be on the same level as payload and headers, which are anyway indented.
But you can have a very long. So this is the problem, that you cannot recognize that this info for this message, or the different object, something like that.
Sorry?
It's a preference to me. Like less,
like in the Python,
the less we indent to the right, the less confusing it will be to read the document, right? At least for me, but that's a preference.
Yeah. And what about calling it metadata instead of info?
Yeah, actually, I think this was my proposal.
Metadata it's also, but I also give the one note that you propose, Łukasz, in one of the issues, and that maybe you should also, but maybe you should also add the, the metadata field to each element, server, channel, blah, 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 operation, yes, etc. And it can be everything, something like, in the Kubernetes, because as I remember, you proposed that inside this issue about the server server grouping, that by this you can, for example, write the metadata, environment, production, something like that. Yeah. So
but it can be extended, like, so you can have this metadata which has fixed fields, and then it's opened. You can add anything else.
Additional properties.
So the info for others. So the context. So in the past, when we worked at SAP with Maciej, we were working on, like, in Kubernetes, there was this concept of service catalog, where you could just register that you have access to a number of applications, and they were all specified with the same schema. So it was super easy to build UI, generate code, people could easily, like subscribe to a given application, get access, whatever. And there was this concept of metadata, where something that we don't have this at Async Api at all. So it was like you have some fixed fields, but you can also have how they called it.
Custom labels. Custom.
No, they called it instead of like they called it not recommendation. How do you say it in English? That it's not recommended, but it's convention. Yeah. So you had some fixed fields that are required, but it was object that was opened, so you could add additional new fields, and not an extension, but like fields without the X dash.
Mm-hmm.
But you also had a suggested convention, like best practices that you know that people use, like documentation, let's say property or whatever. And that was the approach. And everything, and it was always called metadata. That's why I came up with
Yeah,
it's a good idea.
The second thing that I was going to mention is that if it's an info object, right, or if it's going to be called info is for information, right? So I don't think IDs will be part of information, because I think ID is not information about the object. But if it's metadata, then I think it can be inside the object, because it's, or meta information or metadata, whatever you want. Then it's information or data about yourself. Then ID makes sense to be there. So just that, like I was going to mention this, that if it's going to be called information, ID seems to be off to me. Like it's not really information
for you, as the user.
Yeah, like for instance, I don't know, say,
yeah, I understand.
Message, so for instance, message payload, right? So payload is also information about the message. If you think about it, why is it not inside the message, the info object, right? So where do you draw the line to what should be included inside info and what should not? Also, payload is also probably, well, no, I was going to say it's also metadata, but it's not. It's not. It's when we talk about metadata, is a metadata about the async API object that we're defining, not the message in the broker or something, right? So yeah.
So we can switch from the info to the metadata, yes, and everything will be happy.
Have you made sure that everything makes sense there? Like for instance, channel. I'm seeing that you have channel. Inside channels, you will have ID.
Yeah, and it's also the problem that I know that
title.
At the moment we have the operation ID and message ID. Yeah? So the metadata.
But we have channel ID as well.
And also the server. And from my perspective, it can be. To be honest, I don't know how to use that in some context. I mean, maybe in some generation.
Are we forcing them too much? Maybe.
I mean, it's not the required. This is the problem. It's not the required. Yeah, the metadata. It's not
going to use it anyway. Like say, for instance, channel, right? I have a channel, and my channel is user/sign up, and then inside I have metadata or info or whatever. ID what? ID is already there, which is the name of the
address, exactly. Yeah.
The address, exactly the address, or and if it's something different, then why is it different? Or in the new spec, right, in version 3, I think the key, you have channels, the ID of the channel, and then you have address and so on, right? Are you going to put the ID again inside?
I mean, the ID, it can be the different way. I mean, by this, I have the problem, yes, with the server ID and the channel ID. But, I don't want to split or tell in specification that, okay, for the message and operation, you have the ID, but for the server and channel, you cannot use the info.id or metadata ID. Yeah. So
but maybe it's because it makes sense that they shouldn't be there. I don't know. I mean, I'm just challenging you with this because I have the feeling that that is cool, but it is to me, it looks like a kind of generalization, right? Like broad generalization of what it is. Then if tomorrow we want to add something to this new object,
Mhm.
we want to make sure that it makes sense in all of the objects where it's applied, right? So it is like you suddenly you're more limited, and I want to understand why you want to put it there. Because if it's because of the code, if it's because of the tooling and so on, then you can implement interfaces, like I said, and you leave things as they are. And some, let's say, some objects might implement the ID interface,
Mhm.
the info interface, which will include name, title, summary, description, the tagging interface, which will also include tags, right? You can make an object implement 3 interfaces, for instance,
Mhm.
right? But they can all be outside the info object, right? And this way it's a little bit more flexible, because in some places the ID might make sense, in some others will not. In some other, it might make sense to have name and title, and some others, like for instance, name. Does it make sense to have name if you already have an ID? Because an ID is a machine friendly, but a name is a machine friendly name, but an ID is also a machine friendly name if you think about it. So does it make
A
I
unique
actually-
idea, unique name.
so this is
Okay.
something that was created for messages, to
Mhm.
uniquely identify messages, because it was a problem there.
I
But it
mean,
might not apply to all the other cases, right?
yeah, we can still have the message ID or operation ID, and then remove ID, yeah? And then have the
No, but I mean,
metadata. Mhm.
what I was mentioning is not about ID, but about name. Like name might not even make sense as well, because for if it's for humans, then you have title, not name, and if it's for machines, then you have ID, not name. So
Not always.
not exactly, not always.
Not always, because because in one time you can use ID only in the runtime to check the ID of the message or operation, but the name you use to generate, for example, the classes that you handle the given operation or message. Yeah. So in some cases it's not.
When generating code.
Yeah, about the generating, yeah, at the moment. It's one of the cases, yes, that you have the ID and the name. And for that, yeah, but in this case, why you have the message ID and the name in the current specification? Yeah?
Exactly. That's my point. So it was introduced because messages didn't have a way to uniquely identify themselves, right? We didn't have message ID. So name was for that, for uniquely identify, not uniquely identify, but to identify them in a machine readable format, so that you could generate code.
Yeah.
That was the reason it was introduced. But might not make sense to have a channel name. That's what I'm saying, right? Or might not make sense to have a server name, or because you already have a server ID. And if you want something more human friendly, then you have server title. You know what I mean? So
yeah, but we can go with this direction as Łukasz suggested, about this metadata, that we have the recommendation filled inside the metadata, but the another one,
like metadata is an open box there. You can put whatever you want, and we only have like conventions in our tools.
Exactly.
That's one way.
So we can answer.
And then you can have conventions like there are IDs or titles in servers, but not in channels, or the other way around. So yeah.
I would suggest
just make sure we don't overcomplicate.
I would actually suggest splitting this up in 5 issues. Like split it up for suggesting all of these metadata for servers, do it for channels, do it for operations, do it for messages.
Yeah, but
specify this.
But why I want to have only one issues about that and one PR. Yes.
But it's too complex. Exactly as
maybe
said now.
It's too complex, but to something like that.
Yeah, but it's hard. I mean, it's gonna be hard to do it for just one, and then after the one, you're gonna figure out it's actually bad.
Because you're adding a lot of things for servers, you're adding a lot of new things for channels, for operations, for messages, and you're suggesting to add a new info item object,
Mhm.
which is another indentation, which is another feature for the specification. Like this can still be done. And then you just have channels info item object, channels info item object. Like you can still do it that specific feature, but you're suggesting a lot of changes in one specific PR that's hard to grasp exactly. Like as Fran said, I have no idea what ID means in channels. Does it override path? What about when we changed it in terms of like, there's a lot of things that
I think it can be a single PR. I don't think it's going to be huge.
I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's my opinion. Eh? Correct me if you're not if you don't have to.
I just think that it's going to be difficult to understand with just
Yeah.
several PRs.
Yeah, if you do it in a single PR, you're going to understand better the context when you're reviewing it. And also when he is working on the PR, he will also need to like imagine that he starts with servers and everything goes well, then channels and everything goes well. And then on operations, he finds a problem. And then he has to go back and change servers and channels again.
Why?
Because he wants to unify everything.
Yeah, because exactly when we go in this direction that we want to have everything inside the the root of the element, we can split that. But if you want to have every metadata, yes, inside one object, inside the each element, it probably will be easier to have only one PR.
Yeah.
Because you exactly remove some boilerplate from the another.
I think for him and for us to review, it's going to be easier to have a single PR. To be honest.
So the whole goal is to unify all the metadata in one. That's the ultimate goal for this. It's not to add specific metadata for these.
No.
Unify.
Okay.
My suggestion, we already are a quarter after the schedule of the meeting. So Maciej, ask Jonas, he will probably move this to the next meeting.
Okay.
and you have
please move that.
And you have 2 weeks. Like I think the biggest concern is indent and to make sure that it really makes sense. So
and also the ID, the indent on the ID.
Yeah. I mean, but it's just something that popped up on the meeting. But I guess that if just think about providing a full example, like full Async API example with intents, so we see how they look like, and then it's gonna force you to actually think about like channel ID, server ID. It's gonna force you to think about these things. And in 2 weeks, we're gonna see. Maybe you will just close the issue.
Only by ID.
He's already pointing you at what you have to do.
I can remove the ID.
Subconscious.
I can remove the ID.
Subconscious.
For me.
Perfect. All right. Does anyone have any last remarks before finishing? 10 minutes past.
Yeah.
Or 15.
I wanted to share some random thought that I had, but I'm not gonna do it because it can open another can of worms. So I'm not gonna do it.
Or you can do it and then leave right after.
I can do it as well, yeah. But no.
Write in the chat.
I actually just wanted to share some like literally just one random thought, just a sentence, and I don't want to discuss about it. Just want you to think about it. So I will do it probably on Slack.
Yeah, do it on Slack because Jonas has holidays and he shouldn't think about these things.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for participating. See ya, folks, next time. Bye.
Bye.
Arrivederci.
Ciao.